Welcome to our panel. Competition debate, is big tech good for America? It probably wasn't so long ago that people would think that this panel was unnecessary. That it wasn't so long ago that America's largest, most successful technology companies were celebrated as the crown jewels of the American economy. Tech leaders were frequently invited to the White House, and it was tough to find someone who'd say a word against them. That is not where we are currently at. There's now a vigorous debate about whether these companies have become too big, too powerful, whether they're squashing innovation, whether they're contributing to inequality, whether their products are addictive. There's a raft, and whether they're perhaps hurting our political process, or a raft of issues concerning these companies. And we'll try to touch on some of that, with the core issue being, well, I'm not sure it's going to be quite as black and white, where we have one side saying they're good, one side saying they're evil. I think it's going to be, well, we'll let both sides describe their position, but we do have a pro and con side. Starting on what we will sort of loosely call the pro side. On this side, we have Will Rinehart from the American Action Forum, Adam Thierer from the Mercatus Center at George Mason. On the what we'll loosely call the con side, we have Ryan Clough here from Public Knowledge, and Diana Moss from the American Antitrust Institute. We're going to do this in a loose debate format. Statement, counter, rebuttal, and then some questions both from me and hopefully all of you. So as we're going through this, please think about what you would like to ask the panel. But we're going to begin with a sort of a 5-minute opening statement, but I think from Will.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Nice. Will on the far left. I usually don't get this. So first off, I'd like to thank Jesse and Gus for putting this panel together, and obviously my panelists. There's a lot of I think really insightful commenters on this space here. And even though we may disagree, I think that hopefully what we can do today is kind of tease out some of these larger questions. I want to focus a lot on what, at least this kind of introductory statement on, why we care about big tech and then what can be done. But first, I really want to talk about a big company. Now, it's a company that every day you wake up with, and when you go to bed, you also use it. It is the most productive company in its sector. Its employees make the most money for its sector, and it's the largest by far. Few companies really can compete with it, and it rakes in billions in revenue. Now, that company is Colgate. Colgate is by far one of the biggest companies in its sector. And in fact, what we've really seen, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we talk a lot about big tech, I think that it's probably just as important to talk about other similar companies and firms within the industries. But what we've seen with Colgate and countless other firms like that is that large firms seem to have appeared in almost every single industry. In retail and manufacturing, there's been a whole change, it seems, since the 70s. And this isn't just a US problem. By almost every single measure, the OECD also seems to see concentration increasing among all these different industry sectors. Now, the question is this a problem? And today we're going to be talking a lot about big tech, but I think it's important, again, to add some context to this. And what we found, at least in the last couple of years, is this firm inequality has increased. Some firms are doing better than others. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those firms that are doing better, the frontier firms as they're sometimes called, that they're necessarily disadvantaging other firms in the industry. Really what we've seen is a group of firms take off and continue being productive, and yet then the rest of the industry really isn't in the same way catching up to them. So I think it's also important to at least step back and talk about why do we care about this? Why do we care about big tech and big firms? And the reason, or the primary reason we care about it is a general term or general concept we know as market power. Market power takes two basic forms typically. You can have either traditional market power or you can have some sort of exclusionary market power. Now, the traditional market power is what we know of as like a traditional monopoly extent. It's the ability to raise prices above some competitive level. It is the ability to reduce quality or otherwise deprive consumers of some sort of benefit of competition. The problem is that we don't see a lot of this within most of the industries that we're looking at, including the big tech industries that we'll be talking about today. Pre-tax profits as a percentage of GDP really haven't gone up that much. According to Fred data, they hover around the 1950s to 1970s level. There was actually an increase in the 1990s, but it's actually gone back down. What has changed clearly is actually a tax structure, which is, I think, kind of important here. A lot of people, when they talk about corporate profits increasing, what we're really seeing that is, or one good way to describe this or understand this is a change in tax structure, largely from the United States and Western countries and basically almost every single major OECD country. When you look at prices, for example, another example or another traditional marker of market power, manufacturing concentration seems to have not really increased the prices, according to some studies 2 or 3 years back. And again, in services, we also see that there hasn't been a massive increase in prices. What has increased has been output, and that clearly kind of undercuts this general idea of a market power or a market concentration theory writ large. So with that, I would like to kind of think about some of the more specific instances that we're really talking about here. And that really is, obviously we're talking about sometimes Apple and Google and Facebook. The real key question, I think, is, does a competition and enforced competition really help here? Does embolden antitrust or competition agency, does that actually help to support or help to kind of realign markets in the ways that we would want to, again, decrease prices for consumer, increase innovation? Now, again, given that we really haven't seen a huge amount of consumer detriment, I think it's also really important to realize that we're not really good with antitrust and competition policy writ large. Paul Rubin did a real quick survey and found that in about 40% of the cases, there really wasn't anti-competitive behavior. A retrospective of the Maytag-Whirlpool merger, which is another great example, found that it didn't lead to substantial price increases in clothes washers, but did lead to a price increase in clothes dryers, which is kind of weird. And hospital mergers also seem to have had differing effects for insurance prices. So I think in the end analysis, we should be kind of unsatisfied with what we know so far.
All right.
There's a lot that's going on, and I think that we really just need to hone in on exactly what the problems that we're trying to solve.
Will concedes these are big companies. He's not sure there's an actual problem, and he's not so hot about the solutions to the problem he thinks doesn't exist. Your sort of opening statement.
Sure, and thanks again for having me here. Just FYI, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, so I speak from an economist perspective, having done many years of regulation and antitrust work. So first of all, I think, as we heard just a moment ago, the context is important. The United States and the global economies are now very keenly aware of what we're calling the declining competition problem. The Council of Economic Advisors reports, there have been articles in The Economist magazine, scholarly work, empirical work, all pointing to broader concerns about declining competition, higher levels of concentration, albeit at an aggregate level, declining wages, increasing inequality gaps. I mean, the list goes on and on. So this debate over big tech is sort of landing in the middle of this even larger debate over declining competition in the United States. With that said, big tech, much like the Industrial Revolution, we'll call it the data revolution, has brought benefits and efficiencies and that we haven't even conceived of. Increased connectivity, through social networking. It has enabled the platforms to deliver linked sets of products and services to consumers that are very, in many respects, consumer welfare enhancing, and that's important. I think there are voices in the debate, valid voices that are very concerned about whether these products and services have any value at all. Clearly, consumers have spoken to some extent, but that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all, and we need a laissez-faire kind of hands-on approach. So big tech in America will thrive and survive and continue to bring benefits and innovation to consumers in the economy only if it's supported in a market context. And as we know, our markets can't do it all by themselves, right? I mean, we heard about market power, obviously. There are great concerns about market power. And so we need a robust and vigorous approach to enforcing the antitrust laws in the context of big tech. And that covers all three areas of enforcement: merger control, cartels and agreements, and monopolization issues, which is where a lot of the exclusionary conduct that we are concerned about today comes. But they're all very important areas, and those areas of the law should be enforced in regard to the tech companies, and they can be. It is a myth that these markets are too complex because they're two-sided and we have network effects and there's complexity and, oh my gosh, enforcers and judges couldn't possibly understand this stuff. They absolutely can understand this stuff. They can learn it, they can understand it. Education is going to be very, very important. But we need vigorous enforcement of the laws to ensure that the benefits from big tech types of products and services continue to be pro-competitive as opposed to anti-competitive. And there are absolutely concerns that there is anti-competitive stuff going on, and we can talk more about that later. The last point I want to make, just by way of introduction, is we have to be careful not to load up antitrust with all of the job of policing big tech. These are big issues. They include not only competition issues, but other issues like fundamental privacy rights. As we know, the US is not really good on privacy, much in contrast to the Europeans. There are other issues involved, including intellectual property law and its intersection with competition law. So this is going to be a toolkit approach to sort of solving the problem, some of the problems we see today with competition. But we should not load up antitrust with more than what it was designed to do or expected to do. It plays a role, without a doubt. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But it could even be the tip of the spear. But it is definitely part of a toolkit approach that I think is really important for us to flesh out. So with that said, we're now dealing in a debate, a bigger debate about whether the platforms are monopolies and should be regulated versus more considered and reasonable approaches to using the antitrust laws to go through that process to examine what the platforms are doing and whether they are engaged in anti-competitive conduct.
All right, now we're going to throw it back to Adam.
Well, thanks, Jim. Appreciate being here. And I always enjoy having conversations about market power and the question of bigness in tech policy, because it seems to be a discussion that is sort of evergreen, but we always lose historical context and forget where we've come from in these debates. I see a few people out there who are gray hairs like me, who were born before humans set foot on the moon, and you probably grew up in a world like I did, where we had very few informational inputs and technological options at our disposal. When I was growing up in rural Illinois in the 60s and 70s, we had maybe a VHF channel or two, a UHF channel. Most people today don't even know what that is. But we had a couple radio stations, a local library. My best friend growing up was a 26-volume set of World Book encyclopedias. This was the totality of my information experiences and my technological outputs, or inputs rather. And in that world, we lived in a world of what you might even consider informational poverty, or at least informational scarcity. Today, by contrast, when we think about the informational world around us, what do we complain about? Information abundance. We have too much, too many choices. And judged by consumer welfare, which is the real standard we should judge antitrust and bigness by, because bigness per se shouldn't really matter. What should matter is how are consumers or citizens in today's world. Well, again, we live in a world of an information cornucopia, an abundance of riches at our fingertips. And in terms of the key variables upon which regulatory economics and antitrust considers consumer welfare, price, quality, and quantity, we've never had it better. We have lower prices, in some cases free services, and in many, many cases, we have an abundance of quantity. We have quality-wise, we live in the golden age of media, and technology devices and platforms that give us access to an untold riches of informational inputs. That is a world in which we have to think we are somewhat, if not greatly better off than the world we came from. So I'm going to disagree with the statement Jim started with, that like 10, 15 years ago, whatever, we wouldn't have been complaining about tech companies being too big. No, we were. They were just different ones, because we've had a wonderful degree of Schumpeterian churn within these marketplaces. We would have just been complaining about different companies like Microsoft or Motorola or MySpace. I mean, go back and look at The Guardian in 2006 for the most famous and great headline of all time. What are we going to do about the MySpace monopoly? Oh boy, we got over that, didn't we? But that's the question we were asking about every big tech company of that age and before that. Does anybody remember AOL Time Warner? And thank God we stopped the Hollywood and Blockbuster merger of video stores, for God's sakes. I mean, what would have happened to humanity if we would have allowed that to go forward? So, I mean, you think back, and I'll go back further. I'll go back to the old tech titans. Does anybody remember what IBM was in the 13-year antitrust ordeal that the DOJ went through to try to bring down that company on grounds that it was too powerful? Well, it didn't. It ended up dropping that case the same day it basically went forward with the AT&T case. And what happened to IBM? It was absolutely decimated because it missed the microprocessor and personal computer revolution. And we see that story happening again and again and again. We'd be fools to think Schupeterian change or creative destruction is dead. It happens. We have to have some patience. We have to have some historical perspective. And the reality is that yes, today's tech firms are big because their quest for market power succeeded. We shouldn't stop that. We shouldn't misunderstand the importance of that quest for the prize of market power. It's in seeking it out that innovation is born. If you stop that process or tell people they'll be punished for succeeding, you will get less innovation. This is the great lesson the Europeans have taught us over the past 10 to 15 years because you can't even name a major innovator who's a household name in that sector today. So in thinking going forward, what do we do about tech companies and tech power? Well, yes, there are problems. We've heard privacy and some other concerns about security. We can handle these problems without taking the regulatory wrecking ball to this wonderful success story that is the modern tech economy that is really the envy of the world. And we should think about really being careful about undoing what has been that great success story for the American economy. Thank you.
Why don't you like Schumpeter, Ryan?
That's right. So listening to Will and Adam, I mean, what strikes me is that I think we can essentially concede that they're right in the big picture even about a lot of different stuff, and that doesn't eliminate the need for significant, vigorous antitrust enforcement. It doesn't eliminate the need for potentially significant government regulation in other ways. I think that if you say, for example, I think I would actually largely agree. The growth of the internet, even the benefits that the big tech platforms offer, they've offered enormous benefits to consumers. And we are, in many respects at least, in a better world than we were 30, 40 years ago. But that being said, that does not mean that the sort of unchecked bargaining power of these platforms and the power over their lives will always be a good thing for us. And it also means that just because there's been a lot of change in the technology sector, there's been one competitor's decline, another one has emerged, that doesn't mean that that dynamic level of competition will always be the case. And it also doesn't mean that you don't need the government to at times step in to make sure that the competitors don't essentially interfere with what would otherwise be a natural competitive dynamic to allow one company to emerge. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I actually think I agree that big tech writ large, you can't say it's all bad, right? And big tech is going to be with us to a large extent for all sorts of inherent reasons, like the fact that a lot of these platforms are winner take all, do have significant network effects that mean that you're going to naturally see the emergence of a dominant player in a particular area. But that being said, that just raises the stakes for particular regulatory questions, whether it's getting antitrust right in particular senses in terms of merger enforcement, preventing them from using mergers to cement dominance or prevent the emergence of a new competitor in the future, or whether or not it's dealing with with other effects that antitrust can't frankly deal with, whether or not that's privacy or potentially even some other regulatory goals, whether it's interoperability or transparency, where you really do need potentially a more sector-specific, flexible regulator to be able to craft rules outside of the antitrust context. That's the big point here, and I think then we just get into the weeds of like each of these regulatory debates, and I don't think, I guess the last observation I'll close with is, I don't think it's particularly useful to cite the overall benefits of the free market and competition in specific regulatory debates as a cudgel against regulation in a specific area, because we live in a free market system. I don't think anybody on this panel is proposing totalizing government regulation of these big tech platforms of every aspect of their operations, or some drastic extreme application of antitrust law that has no precedent. But we are saying that without vigorous antitrust enforcement in certain ways and without exploring new forms of regulation for the dominant platforms, that over time there will be harms to society. And I think we need to debate those issues on the merits rather than just using a broad sweeping rhetoric of the beauties of the free market as a cudgel against regulation.
Right. If I was keeping score, I would also penalize Adam for using the Guardian. It's very rare that a free market person uses the Guardian as part of their evidence. So very
I was making fun
just
of it.
just terrible format. All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions, and again, we're going to get to you all, and please think of some questions. Now, I've been on some panels and moderated a few panels, and there've been with people who are very enthusiastic about applying antitrust, not in the future, waiting how things sort of happen, but are pretty enthusiastic about right now. So let me ask this side. So is this a today problem? Is it a tomorrow problem? Does action need to be taken now? Is the evidence in that some of these companies, and we can name names, are already hurting consumers or hurting innovation today or tomorrow?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think the context for answering that is, because of this sort of, we have these two camps of ideology. We have the folks who have claimed that the platforms are monopolies and need to be broken up or regulated, right? Well, that brings a whole raft of problems and concerns in itself. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, which you've heard over here, which is, well, markets are great. Of course markets are great. I'm a progressive, and I think markets are fabulous, but we need to protect and nurture our markets. They can't completely self-regulate. And that antitrust should forbear because we don't want to get involved and squelch off innovation through market interventions. And it is a balance. It is absolutely a balance in promoting market independence and incentives versus market interventions through regulation and antitrust laws. But we are now dealing with a very, very different set of technologies and products and services. We've got complexity, network effects, two-sided markets, winner-take-all markets, tipping effects, all these things that economists like to focus on that make for a very complex landscape, right? And as antitrust in the US continues to forbear from getting involved with the digital markets, right? We see scooping up of small edge players. We see more and more instances of the exercise of buyer market power or bargaining power. We're seeing a whole crop of new concerns and problems pop up. Well, you can only wait so long before you really do have entrenched dominant firms. They may not be monopolists, but they're dominant. And they are really in control of these essential platforms upon which other technologies rest that other smaller innovators need to get to be able to reach the consumer with new products and services. So we want that to happen. We want that innovation to happen. So antitrust, for all those reasons, absolutely has to get up to speed and become educated about these markets and these concerns that are being raised. And become more involved. Section 2 enforcement, which is monopolization enforcement in the US, I can count the number of Section 2 cases on two hands in the last 20 years, right? I mean, cartel enforcement is very strong, merger enforcement is stronger, but we see very little in the monopolization space. But the platforms raise all these issues. So it's not a future problem, it's a now problem. And there's a lot of work to be done to sort of sort things out and to choose the best approach.
Well, let's just be clear. I mean, there are certainly people who think, who agree it is a today problem, and have already, have plans on what they would do if they were running antitrust enforcement. I mean, should we go back and should we, split up Instagram from Facebook? Should we split up YouTube from Google? Is that an ideal world we would be doing at this point?
I actually don't think that's what should be done. So what I'll take the easy way out on that question and say, if we had stronger merger enforcement, we wouldn't be facing those types of problems, right? If we had more oversight and more second requests at the agencies on things like Microsoft LinkedIn and Instagram and now Shazam, I believe, is potentially on the block. If there had been more vigorous oversight and inquisitorial investigations by the agencies, we wouldn't be in a position of talking about breakups. Breakups are really difficult. It's a structural remedy. It takes a lot of political will and heft to break up a company. We haven't done it really since AT&T. It failed as a remedy in the Microsoft case. So we need really, really vigorous merger enforcement, and we need to look at these concerns about exclusionary conduct and come up with remedies that are not behavioral, that are not more rules and regulations for companies to have to follow that they can easily get around. So it's a very sticky problem. I don't have the perfect answer to that, but it is a very sticky problem.
Ryan,
If
and
I
I'll
could
have you
just
guys respond.
quickly add, in my mind, just to obviously agree with everything Diana said, that the area of vertical mergers and sort of vertical issues, I think, is something that is a problem, that is a now problem in antitrust law, that it's not, I'm not saying we need a revolution in antitrust law in that area, but I do think that there are significant questions that antitrust law still has to answer that are very important in the area of these platforms that have enormous market power, enormous barriers to entry, and enormous potential for foreclosure, and the costs of foreclosure when they exclude a company from their platforms, especially if the incentives for foreclosure go up because of vertical integration, could be that could be very harmful to a lot of different players in the economy.
Right. Did you guys want to respond to any of that?
So there's
They've outlined some actual today, what they perceive as today problems.
Yeah, and I think that, so there's a lot that's going on here. I want to at least comment on one of these issues, which is just this general vertical, the question about verticals. When it comes to mergers, and trying to figure out beforehand whether or not a merger is going to be good, we're not very good at figuring that out. At the end of the day, so let me take a quick example. I have a family member who helps to run a biomedical startup. And one of the things that he and I have talked a lot about is the fact that really his end game is to be bought out. He doesn't want to create a new company. What they're looking for is a buyout strategy. And it has a name within the literature. We call it an entry for a buyout. And we know that within these kinds of firms, they don't help to boost consumer welfare. What they actually do is just take a pie of the dominant firm's rent. Those kinds of companies, which we see a lot of, those kinds of companies actually really don't help boost consumer welfare. So it's really, really difficult at the very beginning to understand, and to even create the kinds of tools that we necessarily need to figure out whether or not this kind of merger is going to be beneficial for society or not. That to me, we're really coming at the end of the day to a really big knowledge problem when it comes to this, when it comes to mergers. And that is at least where I garner a lot of my skepticism.
Briefly, so I'm still not hearing a good concrete theory of what consumer harm is in this context. How is consumer welfare being hurt, which is what we really should be talking about when we're talking about is big tech bad and deserves some sort of antitrust treatment. Again, I'll just reiterate, by the traditional metrics that we utilize to judge consumer welfare, price, quality, quantity, things are looking pretty good from a consumer welfare perspective, and I don't see a lot of evidence that it isn't. So the question is, what about these other variables? We hear about things like, well, there's now these privacy considerations, there's security considerations, there's a broader concern about democracy, deliberative democracy. Hey, these might be valid concerns. But the question is, what's your proposed remedy? And if it's something from the antitrust toolkit, there are some serious dangers associated with going down that path, because we are talking about mostly information and speech platforms at the end of the day. You have to think really long and hard about if you want to bring in the regulatory wrecking ball, the antitrust machine, to basically deal with some of those concerns when there might be a better remedy. I've even been on record as saying, before you go to those sorts of regulatory approaches or antitrust approaches, I'm even open to the idea of government trying to subsidize to find better approaches to offer more competition through offering new alternative platforms. Because the last thing we want to do is to try to squeeze more lemon out of some old, more juice out of some old lemon of a platform or service if we think it's bad. That's not really going to be the optimal scenario. That's the path the Europeans are walking down right now. We want to find new and better fruit basket salads of different options to offer consumers. That's the better approach than trying to basically get the juice out of the old lemon.
Be clear, do you think there's consumer harm happening right now?
Well, I thank you for asking that, because I was going to raise my hand and say, can I respond to that? So that's not the way the laws work. Antitrust laws don't have this sort of generalist approach and, wow, I think we see consumer harm over here, let's bring a case. That's not the way it works. The laws are very surgical and very targeted. There has to be a concern about a particular competitive issue. and typically anti-competitive behavior results in consumer harm. So the government has to bring a case. For example, they could block a merger of the acquisition of a small edge competitor by one of the large digital market players. The concern there could be exclusion from the market, restraint of competition, raising rivals' costs, cutting the rivals off from access to important inputs or distribution. That's a very specific issue. That's what the government would do when they framed a case. Same thing on the private side. If it was a merger, if it was a monopolization case, same concerns about potential exclusionary conduct or exercising buyer power and pushing down input prices or pushing down wage rates. Those are very specific concerns. It's not a lot of hand waving about, oh, well, we think we have a consumer welfare problem. It has to be clearly articulated. There have to be clearly defined markets. There has to be some clearly articulated form of competitive harm. And that will be balanced with any sort of efficiencies or pro-competitive effects that could potentially overwhelm the anti-competitive effects. It's absolutely a very specific, detailed set of inquiries. So you know, when we see the government bring a case, if the government brings a case, much like they did in Europe, and we saw the FTC try to bring a case against Google some years ago, then we will have more clarity on what exactly the competitive concern is and how consumers are being harmed through higher prices potentially, lower quality, less innovation, less choice. Those are all within the frame of the consumer welfare standard, which is very flexible in addressing these issues.
But you guys don't believe there needs to be some, that the consumer welfare standard, it's a good standard, it works, and we don't need sort of novel new theories to deal with these really powerful companies and so forth.
So my view on that is the laws are durable and flexible, and the consumer welfare standard can handle it. We can define markets, you know, downstream where consumers are purchasing products and services. We're going to define markets in the middle of a supply chain. We can look at things like price, more than price, quality, choice, innovation. It's a very flexible standard. We don't need any overhaul to the law, and we don't need any overhaul to the standard.
Right.
And if I could just quickly add, yeah, no, I agree. I actually largely agree with that with Diana. Of course, the devil's in the details about how you actually apply the consumer welfare standard, and I think there are issues where antitrust law needs to evolve in some ways, but that doesn't necessitate a sort of overhaul of the basic principles. I guess I'll add, like, this whole debate about, you know, is the consumer suffering or not, you know, it's not an absolute question. It's always relative. It's always, could they be better off or are they worse off because of some practice? You know, if you take Facebook and Instagram, the question would be, you know, without necessarily saying we should go backwards and break them up, you can still think that was a mistake to allow that merger because in retrospect, it allowed Facebook to absorb a real potential competitor who could have grown and put more competitive pressure on Facebook. And then today, then Facebook potentially would have been forced, or Instagram would have been offering better services on a variety of metrics that satisfied even non-price considerations from consumers, even including privacy. And so it's always about whether or not we can be better off, even if we're generally saying the world is pretty good, even if we're saying that. I'm not sure we're saying that in every single policy area. But even if we're saying, you know, things are good overall, the question is, can competition make them better, or over time, will a lack of competition really cause problems to emerge? And I think that's the key question, is like structurally, systemically, if there are competitive problems, a lot of which are the type that antitrust has historically been able to identify in a way that's not totally unpredictable or unreliable, then I think you will see markets start to break down when those competitive problems are there, and that's where government enforcement, there is a major role for.
Well, I'll ask you, was that a mistake? Was that a mistake for Facebook? Facebook by Instagram, Google, and YouTube? That's not, you know, maybe we don't want to go back in time, but if, you know, was that a mistake back then that we shouldn't have done and we should learn some lessons?
I'm not sure what standard you want to judge that by. I mean, if you judge it by a marketplace standard, was it good for that company? Was it good for consumers? There's a lot of different answers to this. I do know this, that for every one of these things that we highlight or that we focus on, there's so many failures that we don't. If you want to see one of my favorite Wikipedia pages, go to the list of Google's discontinued products. It's just a river of failure. It just flows endlessly. And we never talk about all of those failures. We focus on the one where, like, do you remember when they acquired this? And oh my gosh. Well, the reality is that there are all the others that didn't work out and that ultimately consumers in the market rejected. And that's a success story about how we deal with market power naturally, organically. And if Instagram's worked out with Facebook, and it seems to have had, I guess, and I don't know. I mean, I use it and don't pay anything for it, and it seems to be a pretty good photo sharing service for me, a video sharing service. My teenagers are all over it. They don't care about Facebook, but they love Instagram. So, you know, I guess by that standard, I'm at a loss for understanding how is consumer welfare hurt by the integration of Instagram into Facebook.
I mean, on that question, it's difficult now to even see and understand whether or not a new competitor would have been created. I mean, and the primary reason why is now that we actually have some time and distance, and that, you know, for various reasons, Facebook has been talking a lot more about their internal processes. It's clear that a lot of the kind of technical architecture from Facebook was actually adopted in Instagram itself. There's actually a really great series of articles from the New York Times about all about this exact question, is how the technology that Facebook has been honing for years and years was actually adopted into Instagram, and how that increased engagement. And this is a very, very difficult question. Is one, do we know, as these kind of mergers, as they come up, do we know if they're going to be a competitor or not? That's a very, very difficult question to look at. Instagram, I mean, the fact that there has to be, it seems to me there's at least something to be said for the fact that Instagram sold at, what was it, $1 billion in 2010. That seems to be interesting because a number of other companies, including Zuckerberg, were given valuations and they didn't take them. And in fact, so again, this comes back to me to really whether or not the company itself is wanting to create a competitor or whether or not it wants to exit. That's a really, really, really difficult question. With Instagram, it clearly is a very large player now, but had Facebook not acquired it in the way that it did, would it be as large of a player as it is? That's unclear to me.
But do you guys have no concern that when you hear about companies, and I feel like we've talked a lot about Facebook, but you know, there's certainly been articles about Facebook, have a very, you know, elaborate system for tracking new companies, potential competitors, and then ones they think are potential competitors, buying them at sometimes very, very lofty valuations. Do you see that as worrisome in any way, that you are, again, they seem to be, you know, you could say, you know, strangling these new companies, or perhaps you might maybe you'll see they're an off-ramp for these entrepreneurs, but is there any concern at all?
What would be worrisome if that foreclosed in a very real way alternative options from developing? How is Facebook's acquisition of Instagram foreclosed the market for video and photo sharing? I mean, consumers still have options there. Maybe it's just the best option on the table for many of us right now, and we choose it because it works. Again, let's link this back to consumer welfare and tell me the story about how consumers are harmed by all of this. And we obviously do have options still.
So just a couple quick observations. First of all, you know, without turning this into a debate entirely about Facebook and Instagram.
You can attack Amazon.
Right. A lot of targets here. So, you know, I think that the point about photo sharing is kind of illustrative, actually, because like Instagram, you know, to think of it as just a photo sharing site is I think a little too limited. The point here is that Instagram could, and you're right, it's counterfactual, we don't know, but Instagram could have developed into, I think, a broader competitor to sort of Facebook's core service of kind of this mapping social connections, this kind of social infrastructure upon which all these other services are built, and where a lot of Facebook's sort of market power comes from. The other 2 points I'll make quickly are just, number one, just saying that Facebook shouldn't have been able to acquire Instagram doesn't mean that we shouldn't have allowed any company to acquire Instagram. There may have been another bigger company that would have been able to acquire it, even if that would have been best for the company, but still been better for competition. And then the last thing I'll say is just that, you know, obviously there's uncertainty, significant uncertainty at times, in all these merger questions and in, frankly, most of these regulatory questions. But just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean that that regulators don't have any information, and that they don't, at the end of the day, have to make essentially a bet over what's going to be better for competition in the long run. And I do think there's a good case to be made for Instagram and Facebook, just as one example of many, that the regulators should have placed a bet on competition and consumers ultimately being more likely being better off if Facebook had not been able to acquire it than others, even if they weren't sure about it.
And I want to agree with Ryan, but also emphasize that, you know, antitrust goes at this by by focusing on the question of the but-for world. What would have happened in the market but for the bad conduct or the anti-competitive merger or whatever? And we have a lot of natural experiments from previous enforcement cases where we absolutely have seen benefits flow because a merger was blocked or some sort of conduct was disciplined. For example, on AT&T T-Mobile, that merger didn't go through, obviously. We're now looking at Sprint T-Mobile, right? But the AT&T T-Mobile did not go through. T-Mobile continued to innovate. They continued to provide feature innovation. That most likely would have been squelched if AT&T had acquired them. They continued to innovate and push out 5G. And the same issues now apply to the Sprint T-Mobile merger, by the way. So there was that. Back to the AT&T case. Absolutely opened the doors for competition in long distance. So enforcers were concerned in those cases about, well, what would happen in the but-for world? Would we have gotten more innovation, lower prices, better quality, more variety of services, but for the bad act or the bad conduct or for the merger? That's the key question that needs to be asked that I'm not hearing. Well, Ryan said it, but I'm not hearing it from the other side of this debate right now. And we have a lot of good information and natural experiments proving that enforcement has actually stimulated competition.
So at least on the T-Mobile, I mean, one thing that I think is probably pretty key, at least in T-Mobile, that conversation is that they got $1 billion as part of the breakup fee. So T-Mobile actually did kind of win at the end of the day because they actually got a whole bunch of assets from AT&T. Now we do know again that there is this conversation about about merging. Deutsche Telekom had said specifically at the time they were basically not funding T-Mobile anymore. They pulled back a lot of investments on capital expenditures because they wanted to sell the asset. So I don't disagree that of course there is uncertainty, and there are probably cases that when we really get down to it that merger and antitrust enforcement actually really can be productive for consumers. That, however, is again, I very much agree with Diana here, is that we need to look at a very specific case-by-case example. We need to figure out where there actually are harms that are occurring to consumers or are anti-competitive in some way. That is a very specific case-by-case and necessary process. Just generally speaking, consumer welfare standard, again, I agree with everyone here. It shouldn't be, and when I generally talk about this standard, I'm thinking about the current broader process that also exists. That I don't think has really been, that has been very beneficial to innovation while also protecting consumers. Now, there is a lot of potential leeway that can occur, but again, at the end of the day, I think that we need to really focus on what are the harms.
So the caveat or the footnote I'll put on the consumer welfare standard is in part because we say we don't want antitrust law to try to do everything, to accomplish every policy goal, and because we aren't necessarily seeking a revision of the consumer welfare standard along those lines, the flip side of that is we do think, at least at public knowledge, that there are going to be areas for these online platforms where other types of regulation are necessary, where antitrust can't accomplish the goal. They even may be sort of ones with competitive type dimensions. Like, for example, I think you'll increasingly see questions of transparency and asymmetrical information between the platforms and consumers become enormous. I mean, transparency historically gets a little bit of short shrift because it sounds like kind of a worthless goal on its own. It doesn't do much on its own. But I actually think increasingly when you're looking at like how algorithms are deciding to put information to consumers and consumers potentially not knowing enough or really anything about the information they're being fed or all the kinds of other automated systems that are acting upon them, I think that's an area where if antitrust law can't accomplish the goal, and I think there's good reason to think that it can't just solve transparency overall, or ensuring competition won't ensure effective transparency in all cases, then we need to look at some other regulatory frameworks and see what's necessary there. So that's the caveat to the consumer welfare debate, is it's not just about whether or not antitrust law needs to be bigger, because even if you think that's not true, then you still may think we need some other regulation in some other areas.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point that, I was hoping we would get into, but, just a note on that, the whole privacy issue, the data privacy issue, which is, just swirling around us as we speak, It's not a slam dunk that this is a competition issue. Yes, data can be a strategic asset. Yes, it could pop up in an antitrust case as a relevant market. Yes, it could be a barrier to entry. Yes, you could use your big data sets to foreclose your competitors. So there's some very specific plays around data and transparency. But once you start layering in privacy issues, you're now really in the domain of asking whether it's a social regulation problem. Do we just value privacy like we do health and safety? Do we need to regulate privacy, have sort of a base level of privacy in place? What Ryan's alluding to is economic regulation. If the platforms have way more information about us than we do about them, and they're benefiting from it, then maybe that's an information asymmetry problem. And that is potentially a candidate for some sort of economic regulation. And then there's the pot of issues surrounding the competition issues. So it goes back full circle to the original points we've made that this is a multi-pronged toolkit approach.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to throw it to you folks. And if anyone has a question, that'd be great. And remember, by question, we mean not monologues. We mean short questions about the topic, ending in a question mark, no manifestos. My question: recently there was an op-ed in the Financial Times that these companies are just too big. You're not going to be able to create a Google competitor. You're not going to be able to create an Amazon competitor. So there needs to be a public option social network, a public option search engine. If anyone wants to just jump to it, I think those are good ideas to explore, or they think they would work.
So this was tried. It was called Quero. It failed massively. So there are. So I actually earlier this week, had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal all about this problem, which is that it relates to this larger and broader issue. It's really, really difficult to create innovative companies that are that have the kind of team structure and the kind of technology that's embedded within team structures that all of the major firms, not just Google, but Facebook and Colgate as well, as to bring it back to my earlier point, that these types of productivity measures and the things that actually we would want to create with a quote-unquote public option is they're just very, very difficult to create. And we see that private industry has done a very, very good job of actually doing that. Now, we could probably really count on a couple of different cases where you had innovative designs and innovative structural management systems, but those are pretty few and far between, and they're usually for very, very specific purposes. DARPA has had a lot of really interesting projects, but again, very specifically focused on an output. And when you're talking about a competitive market where there is a far more amorphous corporate goal, I just don't see governments really being able to step up and create those kinds of companies.
Is there something to that idea, or there's nothing to that idea?
I'm a big advocate of private incentives, typically creating, steering resources in the right directions to create innovative products and services.
Yeah, I'll just say that, I agree. I'm not aware of any specific example of where I think the government should step in and create something. That being said, I do think there are obviously in the internet space, speaking broadly, there are a lot of examples of different either parts of sort of infrastructure, standards, or even services like Wikipedia, for example, that aren't run by for-profit companies, that are run by either multi-stakeholder groups or nonprofits. And I do think it's important to figure out if there are ways that the government can sort of enable or make sure that those models are allowed to emerge where it makes sense and not squashed by large private companies, essentially.
Well, and I would add the rules of the road are really an important part of what Ryan just said, and that would include network neutrality rules, which we no longer have, and which is now going to create problems for antitrust to absorb all of those concerns and problems about unfair or discriminatory use of the internet. So the loss of the network neutrality rules, which is only the government could have implemented and enforced, is really going to be a downside here.
I'm not going to let you guys talk about net neutrality at all. I'm going to question, are we just going to speak up? There's no mics or anything, right? We're just not that big. All right, so gentleman directly in front of me.
Hey, thank you. Steve Delbianco. The question was, is competition big? Is big competition good for America? Big tech good for America? And it looks like most of the panelists are looking for the lens of America as a national entity with some view of competition policy, perhaps a normative ideal for antitrust enforcement, where you look in the about reframing it is big tech good for Americans? Is it good for Americans? Those entities. Now, Adam Thierer talked about consumers and consumer welfare, but Adam only went a part way there. There's different kinds of consumers. People in the middle of their life when they're acquiring a lot of stuff. Or there's young people who are trying to be educated and make decisions. There's older Americans, people who live something different. Is big tech good for those consumers? And then I asked the panel, the flip side of that are workers and entrepreneurs. Is big tech good for entrepreneurs? Big platforms like eBay and Amazon allow tremendous competition among small firms to reach customers they would never otherwise see. And small firms compete better because platforms like Google and Facebook allow them to do advertising to micro-targeted audiences they could never have afforded. So I would please ask, could you answer the question, is big tech good for Americans, looking at it through the lens of the worker side, the supplier side?
Who wants to jump in on that?
I would generally say yes. I mean, you've hit a number of these different positive potential capabilities that consumers and producers and individuals have. More access to information, as Adam had mentioned. You know, you see with AWS and with Azure and with cloud, the ability to quickly get a company up and running and having, you know, an online presence. You see with the Facebook marketplace, people being able to sell their goods online. Yes, generally speaking, I think that has been good for generally most people. There are, of course, probably very specific problems and very specific harms. But again, overwhelmingly, I would say yes, these companies have been good for American consumers, been good for American innovation, and that I think that we focus a lot on big headlines and not with a lot of really, really good data. But that puts us into a whole different conversation, which we can have offline if you'd like.
So I'll just
Dying to jump in here, or ready? Either one of you want to jump in?
No, go ahead and
Okay.
then I'll follow you.
Well, I was just going to say very quickly, I actually think I'll repeat what I said in my rebuttal, quote unquote, which is just that, like, even if you think that big tech has been really good for Americans overall, I don't think that in any way diminishes the case for regulatory interventions or antitrust law where necessary. In fact, I think big tech, even the growth of big tech, has emerged in a backdrop of the potential antitrust enforcement and some significant regulatory enforcements like net neutrality, for example, not to get into that debate again. So I think that, you know, a significant big tech can be good for Americans, but it's going to require some significant government mechanisms to ensure that we, the rest of us, have a voice in what they essentially do to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, especially the way that you've framed it. So, you know, I think there's a tremendous amount of innovation and competition for different segments of the American public, right? We've got the millennials. Some of us have millennials. They fascinate me continually, all three of my children, how they use social media, how they think about the internet and privacy issues and all these kinds of things. But the platforms, which I now call differentiated platform competition, are all using information and attention and eyeballs and advertising in different ways, right? And each has their own claim to fame. Google is about machine learning. Facebook is about social connectivity. Apple is about connectivity amongst all the devices in the ecosystem. These are slightly different forms of competition. That doesn't mean that there are more specific markets where they compete. But they absolutely are targeting different segments of society, different segments of the population, which is great, but it also raises a lot of concerns about potential price discrimination and discrimination across groups. All of that said, we will continue to get innovation and entrepreneurial vigor and opportunity only if the antitrust laws are used to make sure that there is a level playing field for these smaller players coming in to deal with the dominant platforms. And again, that's not the only tool. You know, there are other layers in there as well, other policy tools and mechanisms to make sure this all works together.
Yeah, quick comment.
Very quick. This true story. Last night, my daughter Cameron and I are talking, 16-year-old Cameron. She is a very gifted painter. She paints clothing. She paints specifically denim. She likes to paint jean jackets and pants, and she sells them to friends and to others, and I've helped sell them for her. She wants to think about starting a store. We've put together a list of all the different places we might be able to help create a platform and build her brand. Well, we started with thinking about something on Etsy, and then we talked about eBay. We thought maybe we could use Instagram to highlight, or maybe even YouTube videos. We thought about how we could repurpose it on many other platforms. The bottom line was we had probably finished our conversation by naming a dozen different platforms, many of which were quite big and owned by big companies, big tech, but gave her outstanding reach. She had a soapbox to stand on now, a dozen of them, to reach the world with her new product. When I was 16-year-old kid and had things like that I wanted the world to see, I had no options. I had none. So I mean, just again, going back to consumer welfare, what it means for our current generation and future, I think things stand pretty well.
All right. Another question. I thought there was a gentleman back right. I'm pointing him to blue shirt, dark coat. I'd read your name badge, but I'm old and can't read.
Hi, Ryan Johnson with the Computer Communications Industry Association. So, Ms. Moss, you brought up the old AT&T case. Can we talk for a moment about the new one with Time Warner? And the answer to this question might change when the appeal gets resolved. But do you think that we will see with either the FTC or the Department of Justice a different way that they'll pursue vertical versus horizontal mergers moving forward? Whether they'll do that a little bit more zealously or a little less zealously, depending on how the courts come out on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we don't have all the answers yet. Obviously, we don't know what will happen on appeal. That was a very strong case for why a vertical merger combining content with distribution was going to potentially make it more difficult for rival distributors to continue to get access to content, and that transmits harm directly to consumers in the form of loss of choice, diversity in the media, quality, higher prices for subscriptions and whatnot. So I think the key point on AT&T Time Warner is that we got a really, really crummy opinion out of Judge Leone. It was really, from a legal perspective, from an economic perspective, was really badly crafted. It is full of errors and inconsistencies. We think it is so bad that it actually will be cordoned off. If, say, there was no appeal, it would be cordoned off. And really wouldn't serve as any sort of benchmark or basis for future vertical mergers. What I thought was really missing from the DOJ's case was sort of laying the table as to why this merger was of concern. Really high concentration at the distribution level, high concentration must-have content up at the content level. Nobody seemed to make an effort to create a landscape for contextualizing why this merger was of such concern in terms of competition and consumers. I do think what happens on appeal is going to potentially affect future vertical mergers, not only in the media and telecom space, but in other industries like healthcare. CVS Aetna is on deck. We've got other vertical mergers coming at us. So it's going to be something to really carefully watch.
I think, am I supposed to be answering some questions from Twitter or something, or social media? Or am I supposed to be someone maybe, or is this too much? Am I supposed to be answering some social media, or are them answering? There aren't many on there? Oh, right, manifestos. I got that. I thought so. Let's see, woman directly, I'm pointing directly right there. Yes. Okay. Well, actually, I meant, well, wait, if they're quick questions, we can do both.
I'll let you do the follow-up. Okay. Just, this is for Diana. I notice you used the word potentially harm. Is that the standard that you would advocate as opposed to actual harm, consumer harm?
So in any specific type of antitrust so on the that's a good question. On the merger front, obviously the merger hasn't happened. And so there's something called the incipiency standard, which basically says we should stop anti-competitive harmful mergers before they happen, right? So merger analysis by definition is forward-looking, right? And that's why the agencies are so careful about how they define markets and how they describe potential harms in those markets, competitive harms and harms to consumers. So, a monopolization case is a little bit different. It's not forward-looking, but the government is now in the position of creating the but-for world. What would have happened in the markets? What innovation would we have gotten? What lower prices and quality and service enhancements would we have gotten, but for the bad conduct? So depending on the kind, and then cartels are just easy, right? Price fixing, bad. Market allocation, bad. So it's a really good question. Antitrust has to approach these scenarios in different ways. and each presents its own set of challenges.
Okay, and maybe this is the woman on the, oh, she already has the mic. She's ready to go.
Bromella El Karzazi, IGF Wrangler. I have a question, Wrangler. My question concerns what we really haven't touched on at all at this point, which is there's more to competition than just, sort of mergers and acquisitions. A lot of innovation comes through patents, and we have, Alice kind of sitting there, and I'm wondering, with the landscape of Alice, and how a lot of small companies are really doing the innovation, getting these patents to try and use that as a way to grow. How is that viewed? So I would like to hear kind of both sides' perspective on the viability of patents as it relates to competition.
You guys want to do some brief answers on that? On this side, patents, fast.
A quick response to patents relationship to competition. That is,
they're in the Constitution.
That's a difficult question that I think that you've just gotten into, because there are problems, and I mean, a lot of people have made the claim that stronger patent enforcement can sometimes lead to more concentrated markets. But on the counter side of that patents themselves are outputs of intelligent or productive processes. So are we basically just using patents as a proxy for intelligence within a firm or not? So to me, there's a lot that's going on here, and I don't necessarily. That's, to be honest, that requires its own sort of conversation, because that's a really tough one.
So yeah, I would just say very briefly though, like in my view at least, the evidence is that software patents on like the set of technologies that most people in this room probably care about the most, I think the evidence is that they do a lot more harm than good. But that's sort of an industry-specific observation, not necessarily about patents and competition overall.
So really good question. We could have a whole nother panel on this. AAI, the American Antitrust Institute, has an initiative called the IP Competition Initiative, and we are firmly of the view that there is a nexus, like a Venn diagram, between competition law and intellectual property law. And the concern, of course, is that absolutely the patent system is designed to promote innovation, entrepreneurship. You should be rewarded for your inventive activity. But we do increasingly find instances where dominant firms are using their intellectual property, whether it's patents, trademarks, copyrights, to restrain or to shape competition. We've seen it in transgenic seed with Monsanto, for example. We see strategies around the use of patents, standard essential patents, patent trolls. I mean, the whole thing, that a set of strategic behavior around IP that just crashes into competition concerns. And it's a very active area of advocacy. So.
Now we can continue to ask questions at that, and I think Jessica will take over and handle those questions. But I am ready personally to declare a winner in this debate. I've been adding up the scores. I've been running some calculations, and the winner is you guys for enjoying it. You guys had a great debate, very informative. So you, of course, are the winners. I think my portion is done. I have to pick up my son from improv class. So excellent, wonderful.
We have time for a couple more questions, and then has to run, and then we'll give each side 5 minutes to round.
I've been waiting to ask a question, but I have to respond to what was said about Judge Leon's opinion. At the end of the day, the government alleged that the combined company would spend $36 billion to buy content that it would withhold in order to gain an advantage in the rest of the marketplace that would end up costing consumers, according to the government's estimate, might cost them 27 cents a month, which works out to $3.24 a year for a service that, many people spend $100 to $150 on. I think any economist would tell you that number is statistically insignificant or indistinguishable from zero. In other words, the government failed to show any actual potential harm or to substantiate that claim. So we'll see what happens when this goes up for appeal, but I just don't think it's fair to let that comment pass about Judge Leon's opinion without being challenged. But my question is about unseen. So there's two versions of this question, because there's the seen effects and the unseen effects. It's easy to point to antitrust lawsuits and say there aren't very many of them, but of course the main effect of antitrust law is and always has been shaping the incentives in the background. So my first question is, how do we know that antitrust isn't already playing a huge role in the marketplace and in fact is not already at the optimal level? And then second, in a related sense, what do we think of the fact that in, for example, the case of Instagram, there were many other huge companies that had literally hundreds of billions of dollars in cash sitting on them, Amazon, Apple, for example, Google, that chose not to buy Instagram. Facebook did. What do we make of that, and why is that a problem that the government should be concerned with?
Well, so I mean, on the Instagram, I really don't think we need to like turn this into a huge debate about looking back at Facebook or Instagram. I guess I'll just say that like whether or not which buyer ultimately emerged from in buying a company, I don't particularly understand how that's relevant to the government's assessment of of competitive effects of a merger after the fact. In terms of the broader question of sort of assessing antitrust's current role and whether or not it's optimal, I mean, I'm not sure that you can. My initial reaction, I'm curious what Diana thinks, is I don't think it's particularly useful to say, overall, do we have enough antitrust enforcement, except at a very sort of like, there's obviously a debate going on about how much concentration is in the economy generally, but in my mind that really is just a background discussion that then informs much more specific debates about the application of antitrust in specific cases and specific situations, which is where we can then really actually have a useful conversation about whether or not the government should intervene and whether or not that's good for consumers or bad. And so I guess that's maybe my overall reaction to a lot of this, which is even if the free market's great, even if antitrust law is working 90% well, that doesn't necessarily answer the question of specific cases in any way.
Right. So I have this picture, when you said that, I had this picture in my mind of like an antitrust enforcement gauge, code yellow, code orange, or code red. And that's, that's an interesting concept. I think the debate currently that we're in about whether we've had enough antitrust enforcement and the need for more vigorous enforcement is really based on growing indicators of declining competition, which I talked about earlier. Higher levels of concentration in key industries. The slowing rates of market entry. I mean, the rate of startups is in a 30-year free fall. I don't know if anybody knows that statistic, but it's in a 30-year free fall. We see growing gaps, inequality gaps, and the labor economists have attacked this issue in a really important and good empirical way. So have the macroeconomists. They've been very involved. Here's what we don't have, and I speak as an industrial organization economist. What we don't have is any good empirical work now that tries to link higher levels of concentration, falling wage rates, bigger gaps, slowing rates of startups, specifically to lax antitrust enforcement. Okay, so that's an important study that needs to get done. So even progressives like me are going to make that caveat. We're going to say, look, we got a lot of indicators of declining competition, but we still don't have the study that links this back to lax enforcement. And believe me, that study is going to get done if it's not already in the works right now, because that's the missing piece of the puzzle that we have. And I guarantee you, a properly performed study would absolutely show that lax enforcement has contributed to some of the competitive issues that we're seeing today.
So I know Will's going to comment on that point, but can I make really quick?
Take one more question and then.
Yeah, just on Baron's point really quick about seen and unseen, which is important. By the way, the evil monopolist Facebook tells me that it's Baron Soka's birthday, so congratulations, buddy. You don't look a day over 50. So Baron's point's a really good one, seen and unseen. I think the paradigmatic example of that from the last 15 years is you look at seen and unseen effects from something like the SiriusXM merger versus Hollywood Video and Blockbuster. We turned down Hollywood Video and Blockbuster merging. That could have potentially, there's an unseen cost of that could have potentially been developed into some more robust sort of video sharing platform to compete against online video sharing. That's part of the reason they wanted to merge. It wasn't just local rental video stuff. It was about preparing for a future. That might have been another competitor. They're no longer a major force. By contrast, Sirius and XM, we allow that to go forward, yes, with some conditions. But the reality is that now provides a robust option for many of us who love a diverse platform of different types of options on the dial that isn't provided by terrestrial radio anymore. But it is a nice competitor to the many other types of forms of competition for our ears. And I know Will wants to take on the point about entrepreneurialism and startups.
Yeah, I actually had a paper about this last year. You're exactly right. We're in a 30-year free fall in new firm creation. But interestingly enough, in 1978, Robert Lucas Jr., one of the kind of the seminal economists, actually predicted that. He predicted that there would be larger firms and fewer new startups created. As we get more productive, as we become better at managing teams, it is a better choice to work for a larger company than it is to start up your own company, and that is just the fact of the matter. New entrepreneurs, if you're an entrepreneur, you're typically, I mean, a lot of people, tout the benefits of it, but if you own your own company, you're typically making less than if you were to work for a larger company. The simple fact is that, and this occurs everywhere. This isn't just the United States. You see this chart, this relationship between productivity and larger firms and entrepreneurialism. So there's fewer entrepreneurs within an area, generally speaking. You see that in the Scandinavian countries that are relatively wealthy. And moreover, you've seen that within the United States. You saw this change over time. I mean, it's a pretty well understood relationship. The question is whether or not the number of new firms created currently should be at a higher or lower level. I mean, there is a lot of variability that can occur, but generally speaking, we should expect to actually see this. There would be truly fewer firms, less entrepreneurialism that we understand, but the new firms that are created, that doesn't necessarily translate into innovation. And just to take this point really quickly about Instagram, I think an important thing to think about, and one of the things that continues to make American companies very innovative, is that American companies are able to bring products to market. If Instagram wasn't able to bring its product to market in the way that it wanted to, it may have understood that Facebook was a better means of doing that. And that to me seems to be kind of a missing key part of this.
So we're going to take one more question and then go to Ryan and Diana to answer the question and wrap up, and then over to Will and Adam. So last question. Just we're short on time, so just a brief question.
Thanks for your presentation. You all got a very good point. My name is Li Yang. I think to judge whether the competition is there, or big company, or even big high-tech is good or bad, we have to look into their basic daily practice, whether they are doing some good faith, good practice, really good competition based on the economy of scale, and any good point, rather than ask for government to subsidize their size. What I mean is that they have to rob people, taxpayers' money to make them bigger. And then with their bigger, they maybe use their money to hire some high-tech people to hacking individuals or other companies, their computer or their practices or their documents. So I think we have to look into this, ask the government, not just bad legislation to their favor, or bad proposal, or bad subsidize, or anything privatization, or any other sideline practice of businesses. Important is that they have to be big, or based on competition, or even encourage small firm based on competition. So can we look into this area so we can benefit the taxpayers or consumers rather than based on their size to have bigger influence, including our elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we've largely been discussing, which is the ways to ensure competition, not just look at big equals bad, but more broadly, whether or not it's like single firm practices, whether or not it's mergers, and whether or not it's problems that aren't just antitrust problems, but other regulatory problems, like obviously privacy is an issue. It's not just about dominant firms. It's about a lot of different firms. I guess just to quickly sum up, I'll just make two quick points, which is, I don't think this debate's going away, obviously. I think that the other side in this debate, and we've obviously adopted this kind of bipolar structure here. It's not to deny the enormous benefits of the free market, the even dominance of the free market in ongoing innovation and competition, to say that government regulation is going to be a critical part of the discussion going forward in terms of shaping how these big platforms shape the rest of our lives, and now we have a voice in what they do. And the last thing I'll just say very quickly is that I do think in the regulatory approach, even beyond antitrust, though this is a part of antitrust, you'll see a continued focus on the dominant firms over other firms. In other words, figuring out other areas where regulation may need to be applied, even outside of antitrust, to a certain class of quote-unquote dominant firms, even if other types of firms and competitors don't necessarily face the same level of regulation. And I do think that's one way to potentially get some of the benefits of regulation without some of the costs.
Yeah, I want to make one point in closing. Well, maybe two. So we've talked a lot about sort of the spectrum of views here. You know, we've got kind of the neo-populists on the left talking about how they're all the platforms are monopolies. They need to be subject to things like, you know, really invasive public utility regulation. I mean, that would create more problems than it solves. We have the other end of the spectrum, sort of conservative ideology, which is that government should forbear. We don't need a lot of antitrust enforcement. It will disrupt the innovative cycle, and this firm dominance will take care of itself because these monopolies will be replaced by other firms. Well, we know that not to be true. We know that the reasonable thinkers are in the middle part of the spectrum. We value our free markets. We count on antitrust enforcers to referee the markets. They are judicious about doing that. But those laws can apply not only to steel industries and railroads, but they can also apply to big tech. And then the second point I want to make is that the tech companies are in this debate. The tech companies they're not on the sidelines obstructing and obfuscating and saying, well, we don't think antitrust should apply to us. They're absolutely an integral part of this debate. I deal with them all the time. And they have smart people there. They have antitrust experts working for the tech companies. They absolutely understand and know that the antitrust issues surrounding them and the issues of regulation surrounding them that Ryan has alluded to are important. They're engaged in the debate, and they are prepared to be part of that debate. So don't think that the tech companies don't know what's going on here, or that they are putting up a complete front to oppose any and all efforts to apply the antitrust laws to them.
Well, I don't think Will and I have suggested that there will be no role for antitrust or regulation going forward, and that's nothing we've ever written before, but we do need to understand the importance of a certain amount of humility with regards to the future. We are not technological Nostradamuses who have a crystal ball to look into and say, this is the way markets will work out perfectly if we just do this now. We have to be extraordinarily careful about the approach we take. The approach that was adopted in this country 25 years ago, and thanks to the Clinton administration, is still the right one. It's one that I know Mike Nelson's here, Larry Irving's here. I mean, others were contributing to that vision that was very bipartisan. For lack of a better term, we now call it permissionless innovation, but whatever one wants to call it, it was a vision of generally being humble in the face of uncertainty and understanding that by setting a very simple, basic set of rules for the information economy and for e-commerce, we would ultimately allow America to prosper. That vision, that secret sauce, if you will, worked marvelously for us. We now enjoy an abundance of riches that are unparalleled in human history. And so whether or not we have some big players out there in the tech landscape or not is irrelevant to the question of how are consumers and citizens faring in this new world, and I would argue quite well.
Last thing I'd say is that I typically see this change as a kind of a broader change. Companies and firms and individuals have gotten much more productive. They've gotten better educated, generally speaking. But there's probably other policies that I think are probably better to deal with some of the things that have been mentioned here today. I would suggest, if you haven't read it yet, there's actually a really interesting OECD paper all about frontier firms and actually a whole range of possibilities of things that we can work on ensuring that competition continues to be vigorous within new nascent industries, but also kind of traditional firms. And a lot of that includes the things that are much more difficult, that probably do need to be worked on. We need to talk more about education and getting people in specific regions. As some of the previous panel was talking about within rural America, which is where I'm actually from weirdly enough also rural Illinois. So to me, it seems that the conversation about competition is really we're talking a lot with the the symptom and not necessarily with the cause. We really need to be talking about the cause. The cause is multifaceted, and to me, that requires a broader set of policies that probably don't include competition and antitrust enforcement.
So I want to thank all the folks who worked hard to make this panel